8 minutes from now, you will know exactly what most drivers never figure out about the brake job they just paid for. 8 minutes, that is the gap between trusting a service writer and reading the invoice like a mechanic would. Right now, somewhere in a fluorescent-lit waiting room, a person is sipping burnt lobby coffee and staring at a quote that says $1,800 for a brake job. The paper is warm from the printer, their jaw is tight. The service advisor is already turning toward the next customer. That $1,800 number did not appear by accident. It is the average upper-end figure many chain shops have been quoting on four-wheel brake work for the last several years, and industry insiders report it climbs higher every quarter. Most of that number is not parts. Most of it is not even labor. Most of it is the architecture of the upsell itself, built one line item at a time, each one sounding reasonable on its own. That is the lie, not a single fat dollar sign. A staircase of small, polite ones. Let me walk you through the 11 components of that staircase, because once you can see each step, the whole thing collapses into something much smaller. Something closer to what brakes actually cost. The first component is what veteran mechanics commonly call the inspection theater. A driver rolls in for a free brake check, which is the bait every chain shop in North America has been dangling for 2 decades. The technician pulls the wheels, walks around with a flashlight, and emerges 12 minutes later with a tablet showing red squares next to nearly every line. Pads thin, rotors scored, calipers seeping. Brake fluid contaminated. The driver, who came in because of a faint squeak, suddenly has a vehicle that allegedly should not have made it down the off-ramp. The inspection itself was honest in the narrow sense. Pads do wear, rotors do score, fluid does darken. But the framing, the urgency, the red squares on a tablet glowing in the customer lounge is theater. It is engineered to convert a $40 concern into an $1,800 concern before the customer has finished their coffee. Picture Sergio Vallejo, a high school music teacher in Bakersfield, who pulled into a chain location on a Tuesday morning because his sedan had developed a faint whisper at low speed. He came in for a free check. He left 4 hours later with a quote for $1,940. The advisor walked him through the tablet item by item, tapping each red square with a pen, voice calm and certain. Sergio paid. 2 months later, a neighbor who turns wrenches on weekends asked to see the old pads, which Sergio had been told to keep for warranty purposes. The pads still had over half their life left. The grooves on the rotors were the kind of fingernail could not catch on. The whisper had been a small stone caught between a backing plate and a rotor edge. $40 of actual concern. $1,900 of staged concern. Sergio is not a careless person. Sergio is, in many cases, the exact target. Most drivers in his shoes glance at the tablet, not at the red squares, and assume the colors mean what colors usually mean. Red is danger, red is stop, red is sign here. The careful ones, by contrast, ask one question. They ask, what is the actual measurement and what is the manufacturer minimum? And once the question is asked, the tablet, in many cases, loses its power. Under the hood, the scam is simpler than the lobby makes it look. A modern brake pad is rated for a friction surface that wears predictably across tens of thousands of miles. The tablet does not measure that wear in millimeters. The tablet, in many chain workflows, allows a technician to tap a color category that corresponds to an estimated remaining percentage: green, yellow, red. The categories are subjective by design. A 6mm pad on a fresh tablet might get tapped green by one technician and red by another. The work order that prints out reflects the tab, not the measurement. The customer sees the printout and assumes a caliper jaw micrometer was involved. In many cases, no measurement tool ever touched the pad. The honest shop, by contrast, prints the actual millimeters next to the actual factory minimum, side by side, in the same column. That side-by-side column, what the inspection theater has been quietly designed to never show. The lobby light, that flat fluorescent hum, is part of the staging. It washes out the contrast on the screen, so the red squares look more urgent than they should. The second component is the rotor replacement push. Here is where the math starts bending. For most of automotive history, brake rotors were considered serviceable. You measured their thickness, checked for warping, and if they had life left, you cut a fresh surface on a lathe and bolted them back on. That process, called resurfacing or turning, took maybe 20 minutes per rotor and cost the shop almost nothing. Today, in many chain locations, the lathe sits in the back corner gathering dust. The standard recommendation has shifted to replace, not resurface. The reasons given sound technical. The new rotors are thinner from the factory, the argument goes, with less material to safely remove. Honestly, that is partly true for some modern vehicles, but industry insiders note the bigger driver is margin. A resurfaced rotor generates almost no parts revenue. A replaced rotor generates $80 to $200 per corner, times for corners, plus the labor to install what was already on the car. Think about Petra Lindquist, a 38-year-old hospice nurse in Duluth, who brought her crossover in for what was supposed to be a quick pad swap. She had researched. She knew the rotors on her vehicle had been measured at the last service and were still well within spec. The advisor came back from the bay with a serious expression, said the rotors had cupping that could not be resurfaced, and added $400 per axle to the quote. Petra, who was not the type to argue in a lobby, asked one question. She asked to see the rotors with her own eyes. The advisor disappeared into the back for 9 minutes. When he returned, the cupping had become, in his words, borderline, and the price had quietly dropped. The rotors were never replaced. The car drove home with the originals, properly bedded, for the price of pads alone. The careful ones, in many cases, simply ask to see what they are about to pay for. The metal does not lie. The advisor does not lie either. Exactly. The advisor reads the room and adjusts. The work order on a rotor push typically looks identical from shop to shop. For lines, one per corner, each one priced separately even though the technician handles them in sequence on the same lift. The line will read something like front left rotor, premium grade, and a price between $90 and $180. There is rarely a column showing the original measured thickness. There is rarely a column showing the factory minimum thickness. There is rarely any indication that resurfacing was even considered. The honest shop, by contrast, will note the measurement, note the minimum, and write either resurfaced, replaced, or reused in plain ink. That single column, when it exists, makes the entire rotor push impossible, which is, in many cases, exactly why it does not exist on most chain invoices. The smell of cold steel and cutting oil rolling out of a lathe in the back of an honest shop is one of the quietest sounds of fairness in the industry. The third component is the caliper rebuild upsell, which often shows up on the quote as a slightly fuzzy line: caliper service, caliper inspection, caliper hardware kit. Sometimes the advisor will say, the calipers are sticking, or the slide pins are seized, or the boots are torn. In a percentage of cases, this is real and worth doing. Calipers do age, slide pins do bind, dust boots do crack with heat cycling. But on a car with 60,000 miles and no pull, no uneven pad wear, no visible leak, the blanket caliper service upsell on every brake job is, in many cases, simply padding. A new set of slide pins and grease costs the shop less than the price of lunch. The line on the invoice can run $200 or more per axle. Consider Otis Beaumont, a retired postal carrier in Mobile who drives a pickup he has owned for 11 years. He took the truck in for a routine pad replacement and was told the calipers needed a full service because the slide pins were, in the advisor's words, beginning to seize. Otis is a quiet man. He nodded and signed. 3 months later, at his usual independent shop, he asked the tech to take a look at how the work had aged. The tech laughed, not unkindly, and showed Otis the slide pins. They were the same pins, the same grease, the same dust boots. Nothing on that caliper had been touched. The line on the invoice had been billed. The work had not been done. That is, in many cases, the quietest scam in the entire brake category because the customer has no way to verify whether a slide pin was pulled, cleaned, and reinstalled, or simply ignored while the wheels were off. Most drivers trust the paper. The careful ones, in many cases, mark a small piece of grease with a fine-tip pen before they drop the car off and check the mark when they pick it up. If the mark is still there, the work, in many cases, was not. The mechanical decode is short. A caliper service, done correctly, means pulling the caliper off the bracket, removing the slide pins, wiping them clean, inspecting the dust boots for tears, applying fresh high-temperature silicone grease, and reinstalling the assembly with the correct torque. The whole process, on a single corner, takes maybe 10 minutes for a competent technician. The parts cost a few dollars per corner. On the work order, the line might read caliper service, both axles, $240. The honest shop, by contrast, will only recommend the service when the slide pins actually show signs of binding, will document the binding with a photograph or a brief written note, and will reuse the original slide pins if they are still serviceable. The contrast is not about morality. It is about whether the line on the paper corresponds to a thing that actually happened in the bay. A brake caliper that has not been touched in a year carries a faint film of red oxide on the slide pins. That film is its own signature. Any tech who has actually serviced the caliper will have wiped that film away. Any tech who has not, in many cases, leaves the signature intact. The fourth component is the brake fluid flush, sold as a non-negotiable. Brake fluid is hygroscopic, meaning it absorbs moisture from the air over time, and when it does, the boiling point drops. That is real chemistry. A fluid flush at appropriate intervals is genuinely good preventive maintenance. The lie is not the flush itself. The lie is the timing. Many shops now recommend it with every brake job, regardless of whether the fluid was changed 8 months ago, regardless of what a test strip actually shows. The flush adds $150 to $200 to the ticket. Veteran technicians commonly note that on a vehicle with reasonably fresh fluid, that line is pure padding dressed up as safety. A simple test strip, the kind that costs roughly $2, can give a meaningful reading of fluid moisture content in under 60 seconds. A fair shop will dip the strip, show the customer the color, compare it to the chart on the strip wrapper, and let the customer decide. The honest shop frames the conversation around the strip. The overcharging shop frames the conversation around the calendar. Time alone is not the indicator. Moisture is the indicator. If the strip reads dry, the fluid, in many cases, does not need to be changed regardless of how many months have passed. The work order on a manufactured flush typically reads brake fluid service, complete bleed, all for corners, $180. There is rarely a line showing the moisture reading that triggered the recommendation. There is rarely a date for the previous flush noted in the shop's own records. The decision to flush is presented as a fact. The reality, in many cases, is a guess wrapped in a price tag the color of caution tape. The fifth component is the hardware kit, sometimes called the brake clip kit or anti-rattle kit. These are small stamped metal pieces that sit between the pad and the caliper bracket. Quality pad sets typically come with these clips in the box. The shop opens the box, finds the clips, throws them in the install, and still charges the customer a separate $20 to $40 per corner for hardware that already came with the parts they bought. It is a small line, most people never question it. Multiply small lines across millions of brake jobs a year, and you start to see the shape of the industry. The decode here is almost cartoonishly simple. The pad box, the one the customer never sees, contains a small plastic bag with the clips, the abutment hardware, and sometimes the slide pin grease. Veteran technicians commonly note that nearly every major pad manufacturer includes these pieces as standard inventory. The shop pays nothing extra for them. The line on the customer's invoice, however, is real money. $40 per corner times for corners is $160 for a bag of stamped metal the shop received free with the parts. The honest shop either does not build a line at all, or notes on the invoice that the hardware was included with the pad set and charges nothing. The contrast is not about whether the clips were installed. The clips, in many cases, were installed in both shops. The contrast is about whether the line on the bill represents a real, separate cost or a polite second helping of profit. Now hold that thought, because the sixth component is where the entire staircase reveals itself, and it is also where I want to ask you something. Before I tell you what this sixth piece is, think for a moment about the last break quote you saw, or one a family member showed you, and ask yourself how many of these 5 steps had already been written into the bottom number you were staring at. Drop the year and the rough quote in the comments if you want. I read them. There is a pattern in those numbers that most drivers have never had named for them. We will get to the name of that pattern in just a minute. The sixth component, and the climax of this whole staircase, the single most important piece of the $1,800 lie, is the bundled labor multiplier. This is the one that almost nobody catches because it hides in plain sight on the labor line. Here is how it works, replacing front pads and rotors on most cars is, in flat rate manual terms, often around 1.2 to 1.8 hours of labor. Replacing rears often around 1.0 to 1.5 hours. If the shop is doing both axles in one visit, almost all of that labor overlaps. The car is already on the lift. The wheels are already off, the tools are already out. A fair shop charges the combined job rate, which is significantly less than the sum of the 2 jobs done separately. A less honest shop charges each axle as if it were a standalone visit, then adds a 3rd line for fluid flush labor, then adds a 4th line for inspection labor, and suddenly the labor portion alone is $600 on a job that should have been $3. The labor multiplier, that is the engine room of the $1,800 number. Not parts, labor stacking. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. A real-world work order built around the labor multiplier looks almost respectable at first glance. For parts lines, each modest. For labor lines, each at 3/4 of an hour or so. The customer reads each line on its own and finds nothing absurd. The customer rarely adds the labor column separately. The labor column, when added separately, often equals roughly the cost of the parts column on a job where the parts column should dominate by a comfortable margin. The honest shop, by contrast, lists labor once combined with a small explanatory note like front and rear axle, combined operation to 0.1 hours. That single combined line is the most expensive line in the building for the overcharging shop, because that single combined line is the line that, in many cases, never gets written. The multiplier only multiplies when each axle pretends it is a separate visit. The pretending is the product. The 7th component is the pad grade switcheroo. The quote will often say premium pads, ceramic pads, or lifetime pads. Those words sound like specifications. They are mostly marketing. The actual friction material rating, the FF or GG code stamped on the edge of the pad, is what tells a technician how the pad will behave under heat and pressure. Almost no service writer brings this up. Many drivers pay a premium pad price for a mid-grade pad with a sticker on the box. Service chain data suggests the markup between the cheapest house brand pad and the so-called premium upsell, often 3 to 5 times the wholesale cost difference. The pads are not bad, they are just not what the word premium would imply to a normal human being. The work order in a pad grade switcheroo will read something like premium ceramic pad set, front, $140. The same pad in the same box from the same manufacturer can carry a different sticker depending on which chain ordered it. The actual pad inside the box, in many cases, is identical between the value version and the premium version. The friction code is the only honest specification on the pad, and the friction code, in many cases, never makes it onto the invoice. The honest shop will, when asked, name the manufacturer, name the part number, and name the friction code. The customer can verify any of those 3 pieces in under 60 seconds with an internet search. The overcharging shop, when asked the same questions, in many cases will say the system does not show that level of detail. The system shows what the system was designed to show. The system was, in many cases, designed not to show. The eighth component is the parts versus labor inversion, and this one is short but it matters. On a fair brake job, parts cost more than labor, usually by a meaningful margin, because brake parts are not cheap and the labor, while real, is not enormous. On an inflated brake job, that ratio flips, labor dwarfs parts. If you see a quote where the labor column is bigger than the parts column on a routine pad and rotor job, you are looking at a math problem worth questioning. Not an accusation, a question. There may be a legitimate reason. There often is not. Quick aside, the number on the paper is doing a job. Its job is to feel slightly painful, but survivable. 1800 is not 3000. 3000 makes people walk out. 1800 makes people sign, and pay. That sigh is the product. The shop is selling the sigh. The ninth component is the rotor warp diagnosis, which deserves its own paragraph because it is one of the most overused phrases in modern service writing. Warped rotors, in the strict sense, are quite rare on a vehicle that has been driven normally. What feels like warping is, in most cases, uneven pad material transfer to the rotor surface, often caused by hard braking from highway speed immediately followed by sitting still at a red light with the pad clamped down on a hot rotor. The fix for that, in many cases, is a proper pad bed-in procedure, not a four-rotor replacement. Veteran mechanics commonly say that 90% of so-called warped rotor complaints can be addressed without replacing a single rotor. The chain shop does not get paid to bed in pads. The chain shop gets paid to replace rotors. Now picture Marcus, mid-50s, fleet manager for a small delivery company. He brought a 4-year-old van into a national chain because the brake pedal was pulsing on the highway. The quote came back at $1,680. New rotors, all 4 corners, new pads, caliper service, fluid flush, hardware kits. He almost signed it. Then he took it across the street to an independent shop run by a tech named Dorio. Dorio put the van on the lift, measured the rotors, found them well within spec, and bed in the existing pads properly with a sequence of controlled stops on a quiet back road. He charged Marcus $80 for diagnostic time and $40 for the bed-in. The pulsing was gone the next morning, 1600 quote. 120 fix, that gap is not a fluke. It is the architecture working as designed, and then a person stepping outside the architecture. The mechanical decode on warp is worth committing to memory. A true warp is a thickness variation in the rotor, measured with a micrometer at multiple points around the friction surface, expressed in thousandths of an inch. Modern rotors rarely warp from heat alone unless the vehicle has been through something extreme, like dragging brakes for miles or being driven through deep water immediately after hard stops. The much more common cause of pulsing is pad material deposit, which builds unevenly on the rotor surface and creates a thickness variation in the deposit rather than the rotor itself. The fix is to clean the surface, install fresh pads, and bed them in correctly with a series of controlled stops from moderate speed. The bed-in procedure costs the shop almost nothing in parts. The bed-in procedure also generates almost no profit, which is, in many cases, why it almost never appears on a chain shop work order. The 10th component is the warranty trap. Many chain brake jobs come with a lifetime warranty on pads, which sounds generous. Read the fine print. The warranty typically covers only the pads themselves, often only when replaced at the same chain, often only when accompanied by another full inspection, which then becomes another opportunity for the staircase to start over. The lifetime warranty is not a gift. In many cases, it is a future appointment that the customer has agreed to in advance without realizing it. Veteran technicians often note that the cheapest pad in the catalog can carry the longest warranty because the warranty itself is the upsell vehicle, not the part. The mechanics of the warranty trap are worth tracing. The customer returns in 18 months because the pads have squealed or worn unevenly. The chain honors the warranty on the pads themselves, which cost the shop maybe $20 wholesale. The chain then performs a full inspection, which generates a new set of red squares on a new tablet. The new red squares lead to a new quote. The new quote, in many cases, includes rotors, calipers, hardware, and a fluid flush. The free pads cost the customer $600 in attached services. The Honest Job, by contrast, offers a 1-year or 2-year warranty. In plain language, performs the warranty work without an attached inspection and lets the customer leave without a new quote. The free part, in many cases, is the most expensive line on the next invoice. The math only becomes clear after the second appointment. The 11th component is the silence after the signature. Once the customer signs, the staircase becomes invisible. There is no follow-up. No itemized explanation of what was actually done versus what was originally quoted. No conversation about whether the rotor replacement was strictly necessary or whether the fluid was actually contaminated. The car drives fine, the brakes work. The customer assumes they got what they paid for because the car stops. The fact that they paid for 2 jobs to be done as for jobs, with 3 optional services they did not need, never enters the picture. That silence is what allows the same lie to be sold to the same customer 2 years later. The pattern I mentioned earlier, the one I said had a name. Veteran mechanics call it the brake ladder. Each step looks reasonable. The whole staircase is the problem. So if you are sitting in that waiting room right now, or if you are anywhere near a brake job in your near future, here is the quiet way through it. Ask for the rotor measurements in millimeters and ask what the manufacturer minimum spec is for your specific vehicle. If the rotors are above minimum and have no deep scoring you can catch a fingernail on, resurfacing or even reusing them is, in many cases, perfectly acceptable. Ask whether the labor on the front axle and the rear axle is being charged combined or separate. Ask whether the brake fluid was tested with a moisture strip before being recommended for replacement. Ask what friction code is stamped on the pad. If the service writer cannot answer those 4 questions clearly, in many cases, you are not at the right shop for the job. That is the quiet end of the $1,800 lie. It is not a conspiracy. It is not a single villain. It is 11 small architectural choices, repeated millions of times a year, in lobbies where people sip burnt coffee and stare at warm paper and sign because the alternative feels exhausting. The lie is not in any single line. The lie is in the stack. And the stack only works when the customer does not know the names of the steps. You know the names now: inspection theater, rotor push, caliper upsell, fluid flush timing, hardware double charge, labor multiplier, pad grade switch, parts labor inversion, wart misdiagnosis, warranty trap, signature silence, 11 steps, 1 staircase, 1 number at the top. So I will leave you with the only question that actually matters at the end of all this. The next time someone hands you a brake quote that ends in a sigh, will you have the patience, in that warm fluorescent moment, to ask one quiet question before you sign?